Good morning, good day. Welcome to this first session of the Southern Voices Network for Peacebuilding 2021 Annual Conference, the first public session. I am delighted to welcome you all here joining us for the political economy of democracy and peacebuilding in Africa in the COVID-19 era. My name is Hannah Quibo, and I'm a program associate with the Wilson Center Africa program. And on behalf of the Wilson Center, I would like to welcome you all here today. This conference is being held, as I mentioned, under the umbrella of the Southern Voices Network for Peacebuilding. And today is the first of 3 days of public sessions which we'll be holding. The SVNP, for those of you who may be joining us for the first time, is a network of 22 African policy and research organizations that works with the Wilson Center Africa program to bring African analyses and perspectives to key issues in U.S. Africa relations. It was founded in 2011 with the support of the Carnegie Corporation in New York, and it provides avenues for African researchers to engage with, inform, and exchange perspectives with the US and international policymakers in order to develop the most appropriate, cohesive, and inclusive frameworks for issues of peace building and state building in Africa, which includes our topic today. During the session, we very much hope that you will engage and send your questions to us. Africa program will be tweeting today's event, and we'll also be taking questions through our email. So if you want to send a question, please tweet Africa up close at Africa up close and use the hashtag peacebuilding in Africa. Or you can email your questions to africa@wilsoncenter.org. To get us started, this session is COVID-19, democracy, development, and peace building in Africa, challenges and opportunities. The pandemic has spared no country or global region, and concerns and manifestations of its effect on democratic governance, development, and peace and conflict have touched every region. Across Africa, global trends of democratic recession have increased over the past year and a half. Economic growth has been challenged, and there's been a drop in the crucial flow of remittances, as well as a disruption of education. The pandemic has also amplified existing drivers of conflict in some cases. This is also in the midst of innovation and swift responses on the part of African governments and citizens to the pandemic. The goal of this session is to explore and analyze how COVID-19 has impacted democracy, development, and peace building in Africa. Specifically, it will seek to address some of the key issues and trends and to identify some of the most pressing challenges to democracy and peace building that COVID-19 has exacerbated or amplified, while highlighting some of the opportunities for strengthening democracy and peace building in Africa. So with that very brief summary, I want to turn it over now to our 4 panelists who are going to who've joined us and are going to guide today's discussion. I'd like to first introduce Ms. Tess McHenry. Well, I'll list them all and then introduce them one by one. But we're joined today by Ms. Tess McHenry, Mr. Vemba Dizolele, Dr. Christopher Famunyo, and each of them has been asked to speak to the topic and offer their recommendations based on their areas of focus for enhancing democracy and peace building. I'm going to ask each speaker to give their initial remarks of 7 minutes, after which I'm going to open the floor to all of you to take questions. So with that, our first speaker, as I mentioned, is Ms. Tess McHenry. She's the Director for Democracy and Governance at the White House National Security Council. Ms. McHenry joined NSC from the U.S. Department of State, where she served as the Global Affairs Section Chief in the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, working to advancing democratic and rights-respecting foreign policy to counter authoritarianism and democratic backsliding. So thank you for joining us. With that, over to you for your remarks.
Thank you, Hannah, for that kind introduction. I'm excited to be here with all of you today, joining my esteemed colleagues, Chris and Mavemba as well. I've known Chris for many years, but I think this might be the first time we've been on a Zoom together instead of in the same room. So this already is a consequence of COVID. So today I'm just going to do two very simple things. The first is lay out two major challenges posed to democracy and development and peace building globally and in Africa during this era of COVID-19. And then I will issue three calls to action to address these challenges. So to start with the challenges, what are we facing? COVID has laid bare that the world is irreversibly interconnected. The fate of people, the spread of disease, effects of climate change, the outcomes of conflict, backsliding of democracies across the globe affect every one of us in our own countries. So the first challenge is COVID is accelerating democratic backsliding, as Hannah laid out. The world has experienced a 15-year-long democratic recession. The COVID-19 pandemic has further empowered the abuse of executive powers, and it's been exploited as a pretext for repression. Many of these measures may never be fully reversed, setting new low standards for democratic governance. My own country, the United States, has not been immune to these democratic challenges, confronting painful reckonings with systemic racism and inequality and a fractured political and information environment. Africa has also endured challenges with many years of democratic gains and peace dividends, especially in West Africa, lost over the past several years. And as we all know, following the news in the last weeks alone across the continent, we have witnessed incomplete national elections, ethnic mobilization, civilians under attack and a stalled ceasefire in Ethiopia, restrictions on freedom of expression and social media platforms in Nigeria, and a Malian transitional government reeling from another military takeover, an attempted assassination, chronic instability, and elections on the horizon. So this brings us to challenge number two. COVID has revealed and exacerbated the inequity and fragility of many societies. Governments, both stable and fragile, have failed to deliver effective and equitable economic, political, and development outcomes for many years. And this breakdown in trust between people and their governments has only been accelerated by the COVID crisis and the uneven global response. Many countries, including my own, were not prepared to cope with the spread of COVID and its impact across all dimensions of society. Many people cannot access healthcare. It's unavailable or offered in a discriminatory way. Measures to restrict fundamental freedoms to control the spread of COVID have also been indiscriminate, undertaken without oversight, and in some cases enforced violently by security forces. So ultimately, the drivers of fragility and conflict have only been exacerbated by COVID. And in many countries across Africa, as COVID continues to accelerate, its harshest impacts are far from realized. So now with those challenges laid bare, we turn to a call for action. The crisis is far from over. It'll pose challenges for years, but it's also offered us an opportunity to build back better, which is a phrase you've probably heard a lot. But what does it mean? How do we seize upon an inflection point in human history to rebuild our societies and advance peace and security? So three calls to action. First, invest in prevention. We must focus on conflict prevention and resiliency building efforts, acknowledging that development is more enduring and successful before countries undergo significant democratic backsliding, relapse into conflict, or experience climate or health shocks. Some of you here participated in an earlier session this week on the Global Fragility Act, which at its heart is an attempt to reckon with the wisdom that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, literally. Every dollar invested in conflict prevention saves $16 in crisis response and, more importantly, lives. And this lesson can be applied to other crises we face as well. So this leads to our second call to action. We need to demonstrate that democracy delivers. The best and hardest way to do this is to ensure our development efforts to address climate resilience, health, economic growth, security, and education are inclusive and participatory from the start. This is because democracy isn't simply about elections. It means building the institutional strength of health systems, involving citizens in decisions about their natural resources, and ensuring public administration is transparent and accountability, all of which leads to societies that are more resilient to authoritarian influence, corruption, conflict, and man-made and natural crises. So all of us together have to make the case that democratic governance and respect for human rights delivers, and it's the best way to reduce fragility and advance sustainable development. So how do we do this? This leads to our third call to action. the international community must listen to our local partners and change the way we do business by advancing local solutions to global challenges. Democracy, unlike autocracy, is supposed to be people-powered, and people should be defining what recovery, progress, and development means to them. Our current approaches to these challenges, however, are often artificially divided between different lines of efforts and projects and not locally driven. So how do we ensure development reflects a people-driven approach? How can high, middle, and low-income countries collaborate through development finance, private sector investments, and multilateral development banks to create new tools to boost equitable and inclusive growth, incentivize democratic governance, and prevent conflict and address fragility? How can the international community support the empowerment of civil society and community members to organize, problem solve, and develop solutions when COVID has changed the way they work? Our local partners need tools to operate in the virtual space. They need ways to more easily access funding from a diverse source of donors and investors, and they need the opportunity to invest in local staff and initiatives instead of being beholden to competing or duplicative donor priorities. So in closing, I have realized with the calls to action, I've asked a lot of questions, perhaps more so than provided answers. But I think that the act of questioning how we approach the biggest challenges of our time and what we need to do better is the right place to start. Thank you very much for your time, and I really look forward to my fellow panelists' insights.
Thank you, Tess, for your remarks. I'd like to turn it now over to our second speaker, Mr. Vemba Dizalele. Vemba is a senior advisor at the International Republican Institute and also a professorial lecturer in African Studies at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. And I will turn it over to you for your 7 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, fellow panelists. It's a pleasure to be here, discuss this important issue. When, from our perspective as democracy and governance implementing organizations, it's interesting to look back at the year, starting 2020, how COVID has affected that space, democracy and good governance, especially in terms of implementation. So a few things emerge as we looked at that. First, at the beginning, we were all worried about the rise of authoritarianism and what it will mean for our region where we work, especially for this nascent civil society and political party group. As we look back, we saw that there was some evidence that would suggest that there was a reduction of the political space and civic space in a lot of countries. But overall, it's a bit mixed because it depends on what the predisposition of each regime or each government was. So we saw that for sure that the pandemic was being used to restrict that space. But how do we quantify that? How do we assert one position or another becomes very difficult. There's inherent conflict between public health measures and the rights of people to do what they want to do. So if we take a couple examples, we look at countries like Uganda, which was an excellent student, if you will, reaction. They had a great reaction to the pandemic, reacted early, had measures in place, but this also arrived at the time of election. And the campaign, it became very clear that those health measures will clash with the right of the people, especially political parties, to mobilize. Eventually, the standard bearer of the opposition, Bobi Wine, was arrested for disturbing, for not abiding by those measures. But in this case, how do you judge that? It was not the first time he was being arrested. This had happened long before and many times before COVID. Do you put that on COVID, or is this just a continuation of business as usual? Those are some of the questions that we pose and the challenge that come up. We saw this also in places like Guinea, where during the controversial, the quest for the controversial third term of President Alpha Conde, during the election, those measures came to curtail the rights of voters. For instance, on election day, voters were told to leave the polling station right after the vote. And of course, that meant they couldn't stay, and party representation in those polling stations was limited. This affected the transparency of vote counting, tabulation, and so on. And in fact, on top of the power of incumbency, this certainly benefited the incumbent. We have another case, which is the case of Ethiopia, where COVID became the reason officially that was presented by the government to delay the election. And we know that that was one of the trigger points for the conflict with Tigray, which is not just about civil society, but a political party and state organization that declared that move unconstitutional. So the fault lines and the friction was apparent all over the continent. But that leads us to a couple of things. One is what we know from the beginning at looking at this. COVID, if it has benefits, you know, we talk a lot about the challenges of COVID, but if it has benefit is that it questions the motivation and the application of a very basic and fundamental pillar of political society, is social contract. And this was a test of the quality of social contract, regardless of what country, how rich, how poor, or whatever the country was. And that's what we're still seeing. Of course, the failure of the social contract has always been the driver, the primary driver of conflict in whichever form. We see this in Cameroon, we see this in DRC. If you look at the DRC, this came front and center because even when we look at COVAX, if we forget everything else, you know, Tess talked about the collaboration, the global collaboration between North and South and rich and poor countries. But we saw in the case of DRC, where the country received 1.7 million doses through COVAX of the medicine, but there was such distrust into the product. You know, the president had not been vaccinated, the leadership have not shown the example and so on. And the DRC was forced to relinquish its 1.3 million of those doses and share them with other countries. The other remaining doses eventually expired. And I think roughly less than 100,000 people were vaccinated. So again, this is the intersection of exactly these challenges, mostly internally driven. You know, poor governance will continue to worsen. We also, in the case of DRC, to underscore this point, we saw the eruption of the volcano in Goma, and that brought everything front and center. The reaction of the government, the reaction of the international community, the effect on the people. What does this do then for civil society? For civil society, a few things have happened. COVID has presented some challenges, but then civil society has been fighting challenges, addressing for a long time. But in this case, they had a few advantages. One of them was the focus now on digital platforms, just like we're doing today. Everything went platform, so the advantage was for those countries or civil society that could afford it, it reduced the exposure to physical harassment and arrests and violations that are of the physical nature. They can be a bit they're sheltered from that to a certain extent. The content of their training can be moved online and it can be transferred to the other parts of the world as easily. The challenge, however, is the surveillance. This week, we've been reading about Pegasus, how the new tools out there to help government monitor and surveil groups. How do we deal with that? So there is a cost to that in terms of taking measures. So implementation organizations and donors, while they can reduce certain overhead costs, now they're called to come to the rescue, if you will, by increasingly investing more in that space to help civil society do its work. In terms of recommendations, I will say there won't be any serious peace building anywhere, especially in the space that we work in advancing democracy, as long as social contract is trampled. Donors, government have to continue pushing for this. But there's a challenge of the credibility, on the credibility front of Western or rich countries as well, donor countries. And we see this with Europe, with its position on listing, on prioritizing certain vaccines and that most of the COVAX vaccines are not being really welcome in Europe as they're trying to issue this travel passport, quote unquote. That will continue to drive the mistrust, the distrust. It will continue to drive misinformation and disinformation as we see it here. I will leave it there and we'll take more of our engagement during Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Dr. Famunyo, I'll turn it over to you with a brief introduction. Dr. Christopher Famunyo is Senior Associate and Regional Director for Central and West Africa at the National Democratic Institute. And thank you for joining us. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Anna, for that very welcoming introduction. And it's a real pleasure to be here with all of you and wonderful co-panelists in Tess and Bemba. Colleagues who have dealt with this issue and worked on African issues for decades and who really have been in the forefront of advocating for the continent and for support, whatever support we can provide in terms of democracy assistance. Let me also say how wonderful it is to discuss this topic of COVID-19, which is front and center globally, but especially for the continent, and which in many ways has really sharpened this existential battle that has always taken place on the African continent between authoritarian opportunism and democratic resilience. And that if you look back at Africa, even in the pre-independence period, of course, you know, the colonial model was the peak of the authoritarian regime, but even post-colonial Africa wasn't immune. And that's how we found ourselves with one-party states and military rule in a number of countries. And so fast forward to the early 90s, when we have the third wave of democratization, which translated itself on the African continent by the independence of Namibia in 1989, the end of apartheid or the collapse of apartheid in 1991, the release of Nelson Mandela, democratic elections in South Africa, and in political transitions in big countries like Nigeria. You have that enthusiasm that comes out of the collapse of the authoritarian model and the effervescence and the exuberance of the democratic resilience model. And it's that enthusiasm that carried us for the first 2 decades, since 1990s, to the point where in the last decade, we've now begun to see a decline. The democratic backsliding that is taking place across the continent in the past decade has led to more conflicts, more contested or stolen or flawed elections, shrinking political space, and the inability of citizens to hold their governments accountable. It is in that framework that COVID-19 hit the continent as if a perfect storm at a time when democratization, and peace-building efforts were already floundering. What we've seen, as described by my co-panelists, has been a further shrinking of political space that has made it extremely difficult for other actors other than the executive branches of government to be able to participate in the management of the countries. It's been extremely difficult for civil society to mobilize and advocate for reforms. It's been extremely difficult for political parties to engage, especially opposition parties, to hold their governments accountable. And it's been extremely difficult, even for legislative branches of government, to play their oversight role in holding the executive branch accountable. What we've therefore seen is a number of governments taking advantage of that context to reinforce mechanisms that give them more power or arrogate to themselves more power to the detriment of other actors within democratic societies. I would also like to say that in this context, we need to project into the future in the sense that as the African continent still deals with issues of vaccinations, that this pandemic is going to be with us for the foreseeable future. And when I look at the horizon in the next 2 or 3 years, we're going to have a number of flashpoints where this competition between authoritarianism and democracy is going to come to a head. Obviously, elections do not the democracy make, but by their unique nature, elections have a way of testing all of the other levers of democratic societies. And when we look at the continent as at now, we've got close to 15 important elections coming up in the next 2 or 3 years that will test what gets to pertain. For example, 3 of those elections are coming out of countries that have dealt with conflicts in the past, but that are currently dealing with transitions. I'm talking about Chad, Mali, and Sudan. And these are countries that are struggling to emerge from conflict, but where transitions are being run either by military regimes or civilian authorities backed by the military. In the best case scenario, those 3 transitions could create an environment for competitive elections that would help give a boost to democratic governance. But in the worst case scenario, those transitions could also be faulty and create an environment that would continue in which insecurity and instability would persist. We also have elections coming up in difficult countries such as Zimbabwe and Gabon and Equatorial Guinea, countries whose democratic credentials are doubtful at best, in which all of the principles that have been discussed earlier would be tested. And I think the real judgment call is going to be whether in that environment, in a context and on a continent where political citizen engagement is determined by fiscal mobilization of actors and demonstrators to ask for reforms, whether in that context we're going to be able to help manage the participation of citizens in the COVID-19 era in a way that would strengthen democratic governance. Let me just put 2 ideas on the table for our consideration in terms of the way forward and recommendations. One, I think that we need to put a concerted effort in rejuvenating and renewing political leadership on the African continent, because COVID-19 has really tested the ability of governments to deliver. Obviously, it's primarily a healthcare pandemic, but by its very nature has tested the capability of the supply side of democratic governance on the continent. We have seen governments that were in denial in countries such as Tanzania and Burundi, and the horrific negative impact that that has had on those governments and citizens in those countries. We've seen more agile, fast-footed governments that have been more responsive and that have been very creative in finding ways to deal with the pandemic while still allowing their citizens to participate in democratic processes. For example, Ghana held elections in 2020 that were quite meaningful, and the Election Commission of Ghana was able, despite that very challenging environment, to conduct voter registration that almost doubled the voter rolls of citizens in Ghana and allowed them to participate in those elections, which were very competitive, very close, but the end result of which was seen as a further consolidation of Ghana's democracy. I feel that the governments that have perpetuated themselves in power for a long time are incapable or unable to deal with new challenges such as COVID-19 that require a lot more creativity and engagement, and that require the trust of citizens in guidelines that are provided by their governments. In countries where we have leaders that have been in power for decades, in Equatorial Guinea for 42 years, in Cameroon for 38 years, in Congo-Brazzaville for 37 years, it's almost a given that the lack of trust, the breach of that social contract that Bemba referred to between the government and citizens will make it incredibly difficult for these governments to be able to effectively deal with this pandemic as we move forward. The second and last thing that I would say is that we all need to take a holistic approach to peace building and conflict resolution on the African continent. And I believe my 2 colleagues emphasized this point very adequately. But I will just add that even in countries that are going through conflict on the continent, that we cannot afford to see conflict solely through the prism of kinetic assistance or military assistance. It has to be a holistic package that invests almost equally in building back democratically. Because, and I can say this, and I'm sure our participants will relate, that democracy remains the most viable antidote to the kinds of insecurity and political destabilization that we continue to see on the continent. My hope is that through our discussions today, collectively, we'll be able to come up with some recommendations on how Africans on the ground who put their lives on the line on a daily basis to defend and safeguard democratic space can benefit from the support of partners globally and especially here in the United States to help consolidate the democratic gains that have been made in the past 3 decades and to make sure that this younger generation of Africans who have come of age in the new era of democratic governance can continue to thrive as citizens of the world. With that, I want to thank you for your time and attention, and I look forward to furthering our discussions during the question and answer period. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Famunyo, and thank you to all three of you for your insightful remarks today and sharing with us. I wanted to, before we start the Q&A, just to remind everyone who is tuning in and may have missed it at the top that we invite you to send your questions. You can tweet them to Africa Up Close, or email them to africa@wilsoncenter.org. So go ahead and do that. Also invite our SVNP members who are joining us, if they'd like to ask a question, to send it to me or to raise their hand as well. I wanted to start out the question the question and answer by touching on elections, which I think was a really important point made, that there is a lot more involved in the democratic health of African countries than just elections. But as Dr. Famunyo noted, they are a key touchstone. Can you, and I'll open this up to all three of you, but looking at elections over the past year, there were several on the African continent that were postponed or delayed, and then most of them were either held or rescheduled. Are there particular lessons learned from those elections and how they were conducted, or the results that are pertinent for African countries going into a series of critical election period, as was noted? So I think I would like to turn it to you, Dr. Famunyo, first, if there are any key lessons that you want to highlight, either challenges or good innovations, and then to you, Mr. Dizlele, and then over to you, Tess, as well.
Sure. I think first we have to observe that we can categorize what is happening in the past, put the countries in 3 categories. We had the countries that struggled with their electoral calendars and in some cases were forced to postpone or delay their elections. Ethiopia comes to mind, and we all can see and can testify to how the lack of inclusiveness in the decision-making or the lack of consensus around the electoral calendar exacerbated existing tensions and ultimately were a trigger to the violence and the conflict that we now see in Ethiopia, especially with regards to what's occurring in Tigray. We also had, on the other hand, countries such as Burundi and Tanzania that forged ahead with their elections without even putting in place measures to safeguard citizens or protect the health of citizens and curb the spread of the pandemic. And we saw the disastrous consequences for those countries, which unfortunately, for the 2 I just mentioned, Burundi and Tanzania, led to the passing of the former president Nkurunziza, and for Burundi, and in the case of Tanzania, the sitting president Magufuli. In a third category, we had countries such as Ghana that I mentioned earlier, in which there was political will, and where all of the actors across the political spectrum were able to build consensus on the need for the country to respect its electoral calendar, to hold elections on time, but also to invest in taking measures that could allow the elections to be conducted while at the same time protecting the health of citizens and curbing exposure to the pandemic. And we saw that a lot of safety measures were taken. Voter registration was conducted across the entire country, and a new voter roll was created, which showed an increase in the number of Ghanaians who were able to register to participate in the 2020 elections. The elections were conducted with a lot of respect in terms of social distancing and all of the other measures that were taken to mitigate the spread of the disease. And Ghana came out with meaningful elections in which citizens participated and the outcome of which was accepted by the citizens, which means that Ghanaian democracy was strengthened despite the existence of the COVID-19 pandemic. So that's a variety that the continent presents to us, which is no surprise given the sheer number of countries. And some of the lessons, the principal lesson that I can learn, and I would like to defer to my two colleagues, is that when there's political will, when there's political will and a strong desire to build consensus on how to proceed with electoral processes, we can still be able to have countries conduct their elections, which are a very competitive exercise, in ways that can end up strengthening the resilience of democratic societies and creating better future for democracy in their respective countries.
Thank you. Vemba?
Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Chris. I think the one thing I just want to add, I think I referred to this earlier, the various countries, there's a spectrum that we saw with the various elections, and Chris has emphasized those and exposed those a little better. But one thing I want to is the other side of the elections, right? The elections, the mobilization of the population and the voters are typically done through either civil society organizations, civic organizations, or political parties. And this is where COVID really became a big challenge for those. As I said earlier, the restriction of those measures, the restriction of the space for health measures led to a lot of problems. But we saw how even in this process, we had a bunch of elections across the continent, but we saw civil society really step up. The restriction notwithstanding. So in the Gambia, for instance, there was an initiative, I think it's still ongoing, called Follow the Money, where civil society groups wanted to see how resources that were destined for COVID contingency were being used. In Ghana, the other side of the equation is that during the election, the two main political parties issue very detailed manifestos about how they should handle the COVID crisis. And this goes to the heart. So the elections themselves are an instrument to promote a better social contract to reflect the will of the people. If political parties, if civil society can best channel those, as we saw in a few places, however badly or however poorly that was done, these were great initiatives that need to be noted and we need to learn from for our future engagement in accompanying these countries, because a lot of good things are already happening in these countries. Our roles in our institutions is really to lend support, but all the knowledge, we've seen them, even when the elections, in the case of Uganda, again, even with everything that happened, we saw that the opposition gained a lot of seats, especially at the municipal level. So all that's happened with this. So the engagement was there. And I think it's important for us to note. The opposition might not want the presidency, but their presence is very much noted in places where we think the people come in contact with the representatives. particularly at the municipal level. Thank you.
Turn over to you, Tess.
Well, all I can do is reinforce the things that Chris and Mavemba already said, which are really at the heart of the matter. And I would sum them up by saying sort of consensus building around elections is critical in countries where decisions to postpone the elections or change their format without the full consultation of civil society, opposition, political party members, everyone involved in the electoral process, were less successful and more controversial. And so I think the lesson is that from the beginning, when you need to modify or change elections due to a public health threat or any other crisis, the key is to build in consensus with all of the key stakeholders and move from there. And that ties on to Mavemba's point about the mobilization of civil society and other non-state actors in sensitizing people doing voter education and mobilization. There need to be methodologies, new modalities in a public health crisis that can be leveraged. And this is what I mentioned earlier in my remarks, whether it's virtual or otherwise, there need to be ways for civil society to mobilize the population, even in a restrictive environment. And then I would add on that, very obviously, public health measures need to be integrated into democratic processes. And as Chris noted, in elections where there were public health measures integrated into the administration of elections, and sort of the rules around gatherings and political mobilization, you have seen elections that were run more successfully. And I think that gets to the broader point of elections are critical for democracy. They are a bellwether for democracy, but they're not the only thing that makes a democracy. And a huge thing that makes a democracy is the ability for, you know, a nonpartisan technical public administrative system, including a health system, to be able to support all the machinery of democracy. Thanks.
I want to press one more semi-election related question. There is a common concern that a lot of the attention, a lot of the funding from particularly international partners is focused on these election type events, and the intervening periods are relatively not attended to, not given, you know, the level of engagement, the level of funding, of programming, of support. So I wanted to ask from your positions as especially NDI, IRI in this sort of democracy fostering business, what can be done in those intervening periods and what recommendations you would have in terms of engaging better through a longer time period, both for programming, but also in terms of funding and priorities coming from international partners and the US government. So I think I do want Tess to comment on it from the US side as well, how it will be approached. But I think I'll start with Vemba and then Chris and then Tess, if you don't mind closing us again.
Thank you, Anna. I want to pick on one point that Tess made, and it's, you know, the elections are one tool for better democracy and better governance, but it's really what happens in the interim that is more important, because election day is just a day and then the process kind of continues. And this is why I would say that we as donors, as implementers, really need to focus on building strong civil societies organizations. So in places like Ethiopia, which had tremendous challenges even before COVID, just the transition going from what Ethiopia was to democracy. You know, we saw that civil society there, for instance, was used to particularly perform in the world of service delivery, not in the civic engagement, just because of the nature of the place. But organizations like ours, NDI, IRI, we've been working a lot with civil society, providing civic engagement training, you know, civic education, voter education, and that came to bear in certain ways. In places where elections were held, where polling were open, places like Addis, it was amazing to see the mobilization of civil society organization, to see what they were able to do with just a year or so of training, of engagement. They have ideas, they need to be supported. it's the same thing we saw in places like Uganda and others. So that engagement, to me, I think is very important and need to continue and even be, really upgraded during that interim time. The other part is the engagement of the powers that be, donor countries, the political side of things. We are implementers, we're not politicians. But on the political side of things, the pressure on ruling parties and the government need to be continued. They should not just come as communiques and statements during that electoral time and then quickly revert to business as usual. So if you're looking from the perspective of civil society organizations, for instance, and you see that while you were being harassed, while whatever was happening, there was some communication, and sometimes nothing is said. And then immediately after that, within a couple months or so, everything goes back to normal. It kills the momentum. So it's almost like every cycle, we start again. When in reality, as Chris was saying, the interim is the period where we need actually to strengthen this institution, this organization, and upgrade and upscale the civic engagement. Thank you.
Yeah, I would just add to that, we as implementers are always the first to say to people that elections are not an event, they are a process, they're an ongoing process. And oftentimes we also say the same things to ourselves. And I would say, fortunately, that some of our funders, such as the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID or AID, have been very sensitive to this concept of election cycle, not waiting to put in assistance or support on election day, but looking at the entire cycle, which entails providing technical assistance in the period leading up to elections, around the elections, as well as in the post-election period. And that's really to be, it's gratifying to see that level of support and assistance. And I think that in the interim between elections, a lot of effort should go into strengthening political parties, because coming out of the COVID-19 experience, political parties are now grappling with new challenges in terms of how they organize, how they message to their constituents, how they elicit input into policy formulation. Bemba made reference to platforms being developed by political parties on how they would approach the COVID-19 pandemic. How did those parties get input from citizens at the grassroots level? So these are new challenges that political parties are facing, and one would make a pitch for new support to go towards helping political parties better organize themselves with the new realities of the day. I think it would also be extremely important to invest in parliaments, because that's where reforms can be enacted. And as we've seen, many countries, even when they go through flawed elections, do learn some lessons, and recommendations are made either by international observers or domestic or citizen observers. And it's important that those recommendations be transformed into reforms, electoral reforms that would make sure that the next elections are better than the previous elections. It is during that period between elections that there's an appetite for reforms amongst political actors. And if at that point adequate technical assistance is provided to civil society for advocacy and also to parliaments to be able to provide platforms for these reform initiatives to be accepted, debated, and adopted, then we can all help prepare those countries to be better prepared for the next election. For example, in Nigeria right now, Nigeria, which is the highest populated country on the African continent, is preparing for national elections in 2023. And there's strong debates taking place as we speak in Nigeria on the constitutional framework, as well as the electoral framework for the next elections. And this is the appropriate time to be able to work side by side with Nigerian civil society organizations, Nigerian political parties and political actors to make sure that those reforms could be enacted and to help the country prepare for the next set of elections. Thank you.
So, I mean, Mavemba and Chris, as usual, have hit on really all the major points. I would say, to Chris's point, my colleagues at USAID and other development agencies really are steeped in this, elections are a cycle, not an event approach. And I think I would also expand that to say that, a lot of our development partners also realize that development itself is political. The political economy of development is often central to what we do. And so recognizing, for example, that not just constitutional or electoral law changes or reforms between election cycles are important, but law reforms that need be made to NGO registration and funding, to the media sector, to how information is exchanged, potential counterterrorism laws, the wide framework, legal framework within countries, and how they are changed or manipulated or reformed will often close civil space, be used to target opposition members or people not aligned with the government. And that, of course, all feeds into electoral dynamics, who can run, and how free and fair and credible elections are. This also is reflected in many other things across the democracy and governance spectrum, in how civil society is able to organize and hold governments accountable, to report on corruption. All of these activities, which may not be viewed as election activities, are interrelated and affect how elections, as the bellwether of democracy, but not the only part of democracy, are run. And I think it reflects something that I know my colleagues at NZI and IRI are always reflecting to us, which is that elections are not about election day. They are shaped in the months and years beforehand. They are shaped afterwards. And so being able to approach elections as one piece of a broader democratic framework and development framework in a country, we can help our partners, whether it's donors, implementing partners, or local partners, realize that things they may be doing in economic development or health development or public administration or civil society are all connected in terms of the transparency, accountability of the state.
I wanted to touch on a point you made, Tess, at the very beginning. You commented on the Global Fragility Act, GFA. And while it specifically is looking more at conflict prevention, I wanted to ask you, related to that, but also more broadly, so I will have you start this time and then go down the line, Chris or Vemba, if you'd like to comment. What can the U.S., how can the U.S. Government specifically enhance its toolbox and techniques to better address some of the challenges that we've just been hearing about? So Tess, I'll turn it over to you.
Very hard question, a good question. I mean, I think the first thing I would start out with, again, is this integration piece, is that democracy building and conflict mitigation are inextricably linked. And governments and donors and even implementing partners really silo these activities a lot, right? Reconciliation activities or kinetic action or counterterrorism actions are often separate from building the accountability and transparency of state institutions, from strengthening civil society, from working with local populations. And in fact, as we all know, abuses of human rights and poor governance and poor control over territory, all of these things are causes and grievances that lead to conflict and fragility. So, I think Chris mentioned earlier that, research shows that consolidated democracies are more peaceful, they're more prosperous, and they're better partners in the international community. So I think we should view sort of reducing fragility, increasing peace, working on peace building, and supporting democracy as part and parcel of the same toolkit. And often that involves a lot of boring solutions, which are reducing stovepiping in the government, getting different agencies and departments in donor governments to talk to each other, getting different civil society organizations and implementing partners that focus on everything from humanitarian assistance to reconciliation to elections to work with each other. There's often a lot of hesitance among non-democracy focused NGOs to work with NGOs that are focused on elections or democracy topics because it is almost considered too political. But I think, as I mentioned earlier, all of these concepts are interrelated. And especially, for the United States government and national governments that are looking at promoting peace and stability and democracy, all different arms of the government, whether it's the State Department, USAID, Defense Department, Justice Department, need to have the same mission and goal. And oftentimes it is difficult to have each agency and department pursuing the same objectives. So that applies to us, and it also applies to our partner governments in regions around the world.
Vemba or Chris, would either of you like to comment?
Yeah, I'll just add that my hope also going forward is that we can collectively, and once the Fragility Act is rolled out and resources become available, help a number of the African countries and governments look at what really transpires at the local level in the areas that are most impacted by conflict and insecurity. Because I think one of the challenges that many countries face is the over-centralization of the state. And so, I mean, Tess touched on this in terms of ungovernable spaces and grievances at the local level. And if you look at, for example, the zone of the Sahel, which has become very unstable and very insecure, you have sizable populations that are so disconnected from the central government, either because they don't receive any benefits, any public service from the central government and so are so detached from it, or even just by way of infrastructure, they have no connection, nothing that really connects them to the central government and to the act of governance. And so they become, not that they become immediately violent, but that environment creates an enabling environment for the destabilizing forces to be able to recruit young people and to be able to settle in ways that can further destabilize the state. So my hope is that as we look forward, that issues of security sector reform can be looked upon and can be invested in on a mutually beneficial basis, so that these countries even realize that, for example, when you send forces from the capital city into some remote part of the country, that even in that remote part of the country, these forces that all come from the central government and are seen to be quote unquote foreign because they don't live in that locality, because they've never really empathized with the people in that part of the country in the past. And so even the security architecture that these countries have to deal with instability needs to be given another look. That issues of decentralization should be looked upon. How do you empower people at the local level and provide them the resources to be able to make decisions that impact their lives on a daily basis so they can relate to what governance is all about? Because if they don't see the benefits coming out of governance, if they don't see that they have voice and representation, even on the most basic issues that pertain to their lives, there's bound to be some level of alienation with the central government that only creates an environment that can allow for grievances to fester. And when you have external actors, as we now see across the Sahel, to be able to find root in those communities and further destabilize those states. Thank you.
Thank you. Vemba, if you wanted to.
Yes, I just want to add one thing, which is very obvious, but I think this is still about the social contract and upholding the social contract. And for us in the implementing world, we really look at this through the lens of, on one side, democracy and good governance. So the intersection of this fragility in insecurity, matrix is really the failure of good governance, right? So it's easy to look at institutions not being democratic, elections not being successful, look at the electoral cycle. But what often that hides or kind of misses in the press and everywhere else is the governance part of the equation. And everything that Tess and Chris have mentioned really falls into that space. And that space is the hardest space. So if we're going to work in the Sahel or in the Great Lakes and talk about armed groups and militias, we invest a lot of money. We, by this case, I mean all of us, the international community, in that space. It's much easier to say, people, women, there was sexual violence here, there's looting of resources here. But the main question is why these things are happening. They're happening because there's failure in the capital city. They're happening because the needs of the people, the grievances are not being addressed because that link has been broken. So that's a space that is very hard. I personally don't like the term resilience because I always think it means how much suffering you can take, and I always think, we should not use that term very much. What does that mean, resilience? I mean, people who are trying to eke out a living or get representation are not saying we are resilient. Look how elastic we are. They want services. So we need to go straight to the heart of that, where there's the civic training, where there's so it's multi-pronged equation, as we know, but I think I just wanted to stress that dimension that get lost. Thank you.
Dr. Eze from WANEP, I believe, has a question. So I wanted to give you a moment if you wanted to intervene as well.
Yes, thank you very much to all the panelists. A few things that I wanted them to either confirm or comment on. First of all is the election fatigue in Africa. I think a number of citizens are beginning to think that everything about democracy now revolves around elections, from one election cycle to the other, and that in between, the dividends of democracy is kind of relegated to the background. Is this the trend? And if yes, how did also the COVID era contribute to this election fatigue? That's number one. Number two is that we noticed in a couple of states in Africa that there were bans in political rallies, which according to the state was to reduce as part of the COVID protocols. And yet there were government activities that indirectly were used for campaign. More especially and more painfully is that the so-called palliatives that we are giving to citizens, we have ended up as campaign strategies, during the COVID era. And that also affected the fortunes of the opposition political party. And in some instances, actually led to voter apathy. So how do we begin to now deal with the emerging issue, which some of you have commented on, which is the likelihood of incumbency using pandemic and, in this instance, COVID, to stay longer in power, and say the COVID, maybe through unrealistic reports about numbers and casualties, and saying it is not safe to conduct election. And behind that motive is what we call in Africa tenure elongation. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Dr. Eze. So sort of three questions, three questions in there, looking at how COVID contributing to election fatigue across the continent, as well as government crackdown on election activities by opposition parties, while also continuing to do election activities. And then how to approach and deal with governments using COVID to stay longer in power, incumbent governments. So those three questions posed by Dr. Eze. I'd like to open up, whoever wants to comment first, please feel free to do that.
Well, I can jump in. I was going to defer to my two colleagues, but I can jump in. Dr. Eze's three excellent questions because they really, he puts his finger on the challenges that pro-democracy advocates see on a daily basis and live with on a daily basis. First, with regards to election fatigue, I think the election fatigue is driven not necessarily by the number of elections, but rather by the fact that in a number of countries, elections have lost their meaning. They've been so manipulated that the value, the substance of the electoral process is being sucked out of them. And citizens feel like it serves no purpose to participate in an election. And either because their votes don't count, their votes are not counted, or the elected officials never return to engage with them until the next election. And I think the way to fight voter fatigue or election fatigue is to put more meaning in elections. And I think that as long as citizens see that elections have some meaning, that it is really their way of holding elected officials accountable and that their voices count and are counted accurately, they would continue to remain committed to the electoral process. Secondly, I think the partisan bans that we saw across the continent that we've seen so far in a number of countries have to be criticized, condemned, decried, because we saw incumbent regimes use those bans to clamp down on activities by opposition parties and citizen observers, while at the same time creating opportunities for themselves and their supporters to participate in some of those mass activities, even and in some cases without all the precautions, the public health precautions that should have gone with, engaging with mass crowds around the pandemic period. This is where advocacy and citizen engagement come into play in terms of exposing and naming and shaming some of these governments, that some of these leaders have to be called to account and have also to be transparent, which touches on the third question, to be transparent in terms of how they utilize funding for the pandemic, in dealing with the pandemic. We have a number of countries now that are meshed in crisis because resources that were provided by international partners, even including the IMF, for countries to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic were embezzled by government officials. I mean, that's criminal, that's horrible. And investigations have to be conducted, and those public officials have to be held accountable. So I think that there has to be a collective effort, not just by civil society and media outlets in these countries to hold these leaders accountable, but also by the international partners who partner with these governments and who provide the funding to these officials that is poorly managed, that all of us have a collective responsibility to not continue to lend money that would handicap future generations, but to make sure that whatever resources are made available are utilized as required, but also utilized in a way that is beneficial to the citizens and not to the partisan interests of specific political office holders. Thank you.
So building on Chris's point, I would say, and reflecting something Mzemba said earlier, is that, really demonstrating the value of democracy, the everyday interactions between people and local officials, their local governments, national governments. Elections can't exist in isolation. They're to elect leaders who participate in this broader governance structure. And if people on an everyday basis are not connected to that governance structure, right, they don't understand, they're not consulted, they don't have oversight or participation in everything from local budgeting processes to the role of their parliamentarian to the election of their president. I think that is, getting to Chris's point, what leads to a lot of election fatigue. If you don't think anything's going to change, if you don't think that you are going to have better economic prospects, that you have better equity and inclusion in your own society, it makes it very difficult to cope with repetitive elections that don't seem to introduce any change or progress. So I think, per some issues we were discussing earlier, elections need to be nested in this broader concept of good governance from the local level to the national level, driven by local needs. And people need to be exposed to and interacting with their government at all levels every day. in order to sort of see the benefits and values in election. And then on the issue of sort of, anti-corruption and use of resources, some of you may know that President Biden released his first national security memoranda elevating the fight against corruption as a national security priority for the United States, obviously including in its foreign policy. And that includes, the use of resources and how we spend money and being transparent and accountable about those resources and holding our partners to account for the use of those resources, because corruption itself also underlies the performance of governance and the trust, which Mavemba has mentioned, the trust that people have in their government. I mean, corruption touches all of that. So again, I think this gets back to the bigger question of situating elections within a broader framework of good governance, which helps create peace and stability and reduce fragility. Thanks.
I wanted to add a couple things. Just my colleagues Tess and Chris have said what need to be said. On the crackdown, the interim, as we go into COVID, how do we work on that? I think what we have to see, what we've seen actually in Africa, I mean, we focus on COVID, but there've been trends in as much as there've been trends on the rise of authoritarianism and what we know about that side of the equation, there's also been the other side, and that is the mobilization of the population, especially the youth, right? So if we go pre-COVID, we've seen groups like Yanamar in Senegal, Ballet Citoyen Burkina Faso, Lucha in DRC, Roads Must Fall, Fees Must Fall, My Flag, This Flag in Zimbabwe, and so on. Those movements are not dead. As countries adjust to use COVID or whatever other pandemic may come to crack down, these movements and the youth movements particularly will also adjust. I don't think they will lay down and just wait for the government to do what they do. Everybody's adjusting now. And I think we should not just think of government using this as an opportunity. I think civil society, one thing we've learned during COVID is civil society is very resilient. CSOs have proved that. Even in places like Uganda, if I can go back to where, even in places like Cote d'Ivoire, right? So see, it's very difficult to measure success. I mean, we are democracy practitioners, we implementers, we want change like this. But again, as I was saying earlier, we see incremental change. Of course, if on the other side you want change now, you want it big, but they're happening. They're happening in a way that was not before. In the case of elongation of terms, to use Dr. Eze's wording here, well, we saw that. I mean, Abdoulaye Wade fell in Senegal. We saw the Senegal, which is supposed to be the epitome of democracy in West, at least a good example in Africa. They just went to some trouble. That signals something. We know that that myth of Senegal being like working, functioning democracy that everybody should look at is faltering. I don't think we've seen or heard the last of it. We saw President Kabila was not able to elongate his term. Eventually, he was pushed down and pushed out. So I think we should also look at in the bigger context. And I think like everybody, African youth, African CSOs are adjusting, and I think they will continue to fight back.
In fact, if I may just add on this very brilliant point by Bemba, to say that, I mean, the youth board is really standing up and stepping up to safeguard democratic space. And talking about positive trends, there's a beautiful trend out there, which is that combination of the youth and technology. We haven't talked a lot about technology and what this COVID has brought. It's imposed a learning curve on everybody, but as people have stepped forward to look for new creative ways to communicate, technology has really been put to use in a very positive way. That's what explains, the NSAS movement in Nigeria, with millions of Nigerians taking to the street, organizing themselves through social media platforms to be able to get out and protest against police brutality and eventually against bad governance. So I think this combination of technology and youth, and even not just youth, but even constituencies that previously were reluctant to engage in technology, political party leaders, elected officials are now doing, Zoom calls and webinars. And, in the past, we would have had this webinar for 50 people in one room. Now we're able to communicate with hundreds of people in the same instance. And so my sense is that even when, and my hope, really as a hope, is that even in the post-COVID era, some of these gains should be retained, and we can all continue to see how we leverage new technology to amplify the impact of all of the mobilization that goes into safeguarding and deepening democracy across the continent. Thank you.
Thank you all for those really insightful responses. I have actually two more questions that serendipitously touch on two of the points that you three just raised related to youth and also virtual engagement. So I'll pose those, but first, before I do that, I wanted to read an intervention from Gustavo from the Institute for Security Studies in South Africa. He says that there's an interesting saying that, quote, while democracies tend to be more stable, democratization processes are often violent. And part of the challenge in peace building in Africa is that we get obsessed with big milestones like elections without effectively measuring what are really the daily conditions that make people feel safe and stable. This is why some of the work that has to be done recently on that has been done on the idea of everyday peace should be directly linked to broader political processes, elections, and creation of a stable and effective institutions. So I wanted to share that intervention from Gustavo. Two questions now that I'll pose both at the same time. Feel free, please, to respond to both or one. The first one comes from Professor Anne Moisan, who's the Chair of Strategic Studies at the National Defense University. The professor asks, she says, it appears that there are numerous recommendations on what the West should and must do to assist African countries in democratization. This is against a backdrop where the West is focused on / prioritizing their own redemocratization and rebuilding. However, in this and most other webinars on Africa, about what actions Africans are willing to take and hard trade-offs. These actions fall far short of what young people are still concerned about and protesting regarding corruption and longstanding grievances that COVID has exacerbated. How should African countries proceed? So Catherine will post that so you can read it as well. But looking at that supply and demand gap, particularly for what was just mentioned with youth-led protests. So that's the first question. I'll give you a second to think about that. The second one comes from Dr. Monde, Director of the Africa Program, asking about this virtual space and increased engagement, both for civil society, citizens, governments, and what are the best practices, for safeguarding democracy when citizens have been pushed into this virtual space? That Pegasus and that reporting was mentioned at the top of this event. So what are some of the tools and how can democracy be safeguarded in that more virtual space? So both those questions you can answer in any order that you would want. Would anyone in particular like to go first? Just dive right in.
I'll go first, if I may. I'll just say, first of all, I agree with Gustavo. It is, I think that's what we've been grappling with for a number of years now. So he was right, spot on. In terms of the question by Professor Moisan, it's a challenging situation we are in. We are talking from the implementer's perspective. Tess, of course, working with the government. We're in the West. We're on the supplier side. So it's a bit challenging because often we do not always have those voices from Africa. We don't speak for them. We speak about what we observe and what we do. And personally, I always think it's very interesting, especially on the ground, to hear their own voices and use it in our own recommendations and how we adjust our approach to whatever we do. So in this new world, quote unquote, of digital platform, this has become more feasible. You know, a couple times we've hosted our big events, let's say on the Gambia, big discussion, constitutional review, or the state of election in Africa during COVID. And we're able to have very high profile, very knowledgeable actors on the continent join us. One of the advantages of this platform is you can be in your shorts in Zimbabwe, you can be a senator. We don't have to pay for your per diem. We don't have to fly you. You don't have to go to the embassy, wait in long line for your visa. So we can have those conversations in ways that were not possible before. That has been actually very good to us and for us. And I think that's a trend that as long as we continue to be in this COVID period where digital platforms are still the big meeting places, I think to address that side of the equation that the professor is raising, that's one way. So we hear more for their own perspectives. They're not particularly being published in the New York Times, in the places where those voices can be heard. So there's a discrepancy there. And I think digital platforms are one way that we can address, at least help mitigate that. In terms of the best practices for digital platforms or the digital world, it's still unfolding, I think, Monday. So I think we're still learning. It's kind of hard to really say. I think one thing I can at least attest to is it reduces certain things. It reduces cost of certain things. If we want to, it's easier to share knowledge with various experiences now because some of this training, some of this content is easily portable, or you can offshore things easily. In terms of the protection itself, I think we are learning it's the cat and mouse game that will remain with us for a long time, I think, if I can just project into the future. I don't think we're going back fully to the old way of doing things face-to-face. I think I see that we're going to a hybrid world. Already with our companies, our organization, that's happening with universities. I just spent a semester teaching from overseas. I've never met a single one of my students, and they were in different parts of the country, of the world, literally. For us in the democracy and good governance space, the worry is mostly about the protection. How do we protect ourselves from the negative forces, so to speak? And the negative forces are just as strong as technology. I don't have any good answer to that in terms of best practices yet, because I think we're still in a learning process. My colleagues probably are turning the mic to you if you have any reaction to that. Thank you.
Sure. If I can just make 3 quick points, since we're running out of time. First, on Gustavo's question, I agree completely. And I think that's why a lot of the work that is being done by the Institute for Strategic Studies, Afrobarometer, those think tanks on the continent that can help decipher public opinion and citizen needs on a regular basis. I think we need to find ways to integrate those needs or the expression of those needs into the daily conversations about service delivery and democratic governance. If we have to find a way, because if that vacuum persists, then it's going to be difficult to really find out what citizens need, how they appreciate their government services, how they appreciate public services, and how governments can respond as a governance issue on a daily basis. So I would encourage more Afrobarometers, more ISS and other groups that can, and media outlets that can make this part of their daily responsibility so that those citizens' needs are integrated into public service delivery. On Dr. Catherine's point, the West and Africa, I don't want to say versus, I think we're now in a global village kind of. And it's fair to say that the democratic backsliding that we've seen on the continent has been exacerbated also by poor democratic performance of countries in the Northern Hemisphere in the last decade. And you almost feel like there's a copycat actions by authoritarian regimes on the continent who say, oh, if people in Washington can get away with saying things like this or doing things like this, then why question me if I do similar things? And my hope is that now that most Western governments have looked down the barrel and are not pleased with what they've seen, that as they work to rebuild their own democratic institutions or strengthen them further, that the ripple effect of that positive action can also be felt across the continent because these things are not mutually exclusive. One of the benefits that we have on the continent right now is that we have instruments coming out of the African Union, such as the African Union Charter on Democracy, Elections, and Governance. And when most young people take to the streets in Africa today, they're also challenging the African Union to live up to its own charter and to call up, to call governments in when they're performing poorly in terms of respecting the EU Charter. So that's a lot out there in terms of behavior of countries and leaders, as well as instruments, whether they're global instruments or continent-specific instruments that pro-democracy elements on the African continent can rely on. But we're in this global village where actions in London or Paris or Hungary or what transpires in other countries can also impact how people relate to governance on the African continent. And my last point about Monday's question is, I think we need to find ways to safeguard these virtual spaces. We saw, even before COVID-19, how governments on the continent, shut down internet. And that made it extremely difficult for citizens to be able to communicate, for civil society to be able to engage. I think the track record on that from countries such as Uganda, Chad, Cameroon, Congo, Brazzaville, shutting down internet around elections was becoming a common practice. I think we have to raise the decibel level in terms of condemning such actions. We've now seen in Nigeria, vibrant society, the ban on Twitter that completely shuts out 70 million Nigerians on what's a very busy social virtual platform. We cannot allow that to become a permanent fixture or a permanent way of doing business for a big country as big as Nigeria that should be playing on the global stage. So I think that's a question out there that we collectively take measures to safeguard this space because, having been pushed into this space by COVID, this space is now going to be with us for the duration. And safeguarding this space will be extremely important for citizens, ordinary citizens, and civil society across the African continent. Thank you.
So what I'll say at the end here and be brief is precisely what Chris mentioned, which is I think the fate of democracies around the world are interlinked, and we should all be getting our own houses in order. We should all be improving our own democracies as we support other democracies around the world, Africa, Europe, elsewhere, and improving theirs. I think realizing those two things are interlinked, have to be interlinked, will help all of us. As Chris said, local mechanisms, regional mechanisms, the AU, ECOWAS, international mechanisms in solidarity, whether formally at the United Nations or otherwise through other groups of states, everything from donor assistance to local initiatives, all democratic growth has to be pushed through all of these mechanisms. And I think importantly, working on the demand and supply side of democracy simultaneously, which is sort of an oversimplified answer, but we need to be supporting especially the youth voices that Afrobarometer, in fact, have shown overwhelmingly support democracy in Africa. We need to support those voices to be vibrant and loud and demanding accountability from the government at the same time that we support and encourage and hold to account governments to deliver services and deliver democracy. And then on the second point of sort of technology space during COVID and how do we protect ourselves, and per Chris's point, a free, open, interoperable, secure internet is the basis for this type of organization of civil society and other forces online. It needs to be protected. At the same time of enabling platforms for people to organize, we need to be able to provide protection for people who are targeted. You all may know this growing trend of transnational repression where autocratic leaders reach across borders, which is enabled by cyberspace to target dissidents, opponents, media, civil society, to silence them, to surveil them, to track them with spyware, obviously. And so the international community also has to reckon with establishing, sharing, and implementing norms for the democratic use of technology. Thank you.
Thank you, Tess. And it's fitting that you gave us our last word as you started us off. So thank you so much for that. We are out of time. This was a really, really rich discussion. And I'm so grateful that you joined us. Thank you for coming and speaking. Thank you to our participants who joined online for sending your questions as well. I want to invite everyone to our next session as we continue on with the SVNP conference. It's going to actually give us a chance to delve a little bit deeper into a lot of the issues raised in this first session. So it's going to be looking at gender, youth, technology, and democracy and development in this COVID-19 era. So a little bit of a deeper dive on some of these issues and concerns. So I hope you'll stay. You can visit our Africa program website for more information on the SVNP, on the Southern Voices Network for Peacebuilding, and the rest of the events this week. So with that, thank you very much to our speakers.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.